Hi, my name is John DeRosso, and for nearly 30 years I've been involved in the art of antique restoration and the refinishing of fine furniture. The purpose of this video is to help you, the homeowner, tackle projects they never thought they'd have the time or knowledge to complete. We'll be going through this in a step-by-step process using materials that are readily available at your local home improvement center. And more importantly, we'll be tackling these projects in a realistic amount of time. Our first step is going to be to purchase the materials needed for this project. We're going to divide these materials into three categories. First will be materials for stripping. Second will be our materials needed for finishing. And third, if need be, will be our materials for repair. Now, to start with our stripping materials, first and foremost is personal protection. What I like to use is a pair of medium grade rubber gloves, which will primarily be for the use with paint remover. Also, we don't want to forget eye protection. Now, to go on to our stripping materials, first thing I would suggest is a paste paint remover. Reason being, the paste paint remover will give us more time before it sets up and dries, and also has better clinging ability. We're going to need denatured alcohol, a sleeve of No. 1 steel wool, a paintbrush, which for most instances for stripping can be a throwaway paintbrush. And what I like to use is sawdust, but since sawdust is not readily available, what I've chosen here is animal bedding, which can be purchased in any pet store. A fairly flexible scraper for stripping flat surfaces. And lastly, a typical scrub brush, which you can find in any supermarket. Our next category will be finishing materials. For this project, we'll be using shellac and polyurethane. Now, what we're going to be using for this is an amber, also known as orange shellac, paintbrush, and over here we have two different polys. One would be a gloss and one being a semi-gloss. A medium to dark brown paste wax, stains depending on the color of the project to be used, 600 wet and dry sandpaper, and a Scotch-Brite pad if available. Finally, we're also going to be using 4/0 steel wool. And our last category will be repair materials. The projects we'll be working on today, there's going to be some minor repair on one of the pieces. So what I'd like to be using for this would be a yellow carpenter's glue, masking tape, two different color wood fillers, a darker and a lighter, a small flexible scraper, a hacksaw blade, utility knife, and either 100 or 150 grade sandpaper. The two projects we'll be working on today are a 1940s style pedestal table, which we can see here has a veneered top, and the other one is going to be an antique walnut chair frame. Our next step is going to be to check for structural repairs on our two projects. The chair seems to be sound. The chair is made of solid, what appears to be walnut, and I don't seem to see any open glue joints, breaks, or anything else, so this chair should be ready to strip. Our table, on the other hand, seems to have some problems on the top being veneer. We're going to have to do some structural repair over here. The base of our table seems to be quite sound. So let's bring this down. And the easiest way to find veneer repairs is doing the following. It's fairly typical for old pieces of veneered furniture to have areas where the veneer is loosened up. Now, the easiest way to find that is actually by sound. What we can do is take our hacksaw blade and slowly tap. And when you find loose areas, what you'll hear is more of a hollow sound. Now, the easiest way to glue these, we're going to take a utility knife and just slightly get underneath these loose spots, just to loosen it up a little bit. And next thing we're going to do is take the hacksaw blade that we purchased earlier, and what I like to do is break it in half. It makes it a little bit easier to use. And we're going to use this as a glue applicator. Now, for repair like this, we don't have to use a very large amount of glue. What we're going to do is just slowly work the glue underneath the veneered area. Now, we're going to make a little bit of a mess over here. But given the fact that we're doing the repair before the refinishing, that shouldn't pose a problem. Now what we want to do is make sure we get this glue underneath. Again, we don't have to have a ton of glue under here, just enough to get that repair to hold. Next, what we're going to do is take a roll of masking tape, and we're going to use this masking tape almost as a clamp. Go over our repaired area. Make sure we pull it down as tight as possible. Now, it's also fairly typical for veneered pieces to have areas where there may be small chips in the veneer. What we're going to do next is pick an appropriate filler to use on these. And more importantly, what we want to do is fill these areas before we strip them. What that does is it keeps us from seeing a shadow from where the filler's been applied. One of the things we want to do when choosing a wood filler is choose something that's appropriate for the piece we're working on. Over here we're working on what appears to be a walnut top, so what we want to use is something on the darker side, which over here we'll choose a walnut filler. Now we're simply going to use our knife and just put in enough to fill that small space. Our second space over here. And this filler should be dry within about 2 hours. Our glue, however, will probably take a minimum of 4 hours to dry since we're going to be stripping the piece. So what we'll do is put this on the side for about 4 hours, let that glued veneer dry before we start stripping. Now we're ready to begin our next step, which is going to be stripping our two project pieces. First thing we want to do is look for anything on the piece that we may not want to strip. In this case, on this piece, what we'd like to do is first is take off the pull on our drawer. So we'll quickly remove this pull, and we're going to put this on the side for later. Now, as I mentioned before, first and foremost is personal protection. We want to make sure we're wearing our goggles and a good pair of stripping gloves. So we'll put these goggles on, so we have our eye protection, our stripping gloves, and when working indoors, you should always remember to use adequate ventilation. You should follow all instructions on the manufacturer's labels. What I'd like to use is a paste remover. The reason I use a paste remover is because it evaporates much slower than a liquid, and it has much better cleaning capabilities. So first we're going to start with our chair, and we're going to liberally apply this remover. And what we want to do is, depending on how much finish is on the piece, we want to keep this wet for at least 15 minutes, more likely 20 minutes to a half hour. What we want to do is any part of this chair that's going to be finished, we want to make sure we hit it. And first coat, you're going to notice, is going to soak right in. It's going to dry fairly quickly. But as the remover permeates the finish, you'll notice it dries slower and slower. And at this point, what you want to do is try to work in very slow, even strokes, thereby keeping the remover from splattering. Okay, looks like we've got a good coat on our chair to start. And since we've got two pieces going here, what we'll do is let this soak in. And in this instance, I think I'm going to leave the drawer interior as it is, and we'll probably just give that a little bit of a cleaning with the alcohol later on. So we do want to show a little bit of age on this piece. And now we're also going to get a better idea what type of wood we're working with on this table, which is fairly common for reproduction pieces such as this to have two different woods, or even three sometimes. So what we may end up having to do is a little bit of staining later on to match this face into our top. This paste remover dries a lot slower than if you were using a liquid remover. And one thing you'll also notice is it doesn't splatter anywhere near the way a liquid remover does. Okay, I'm just going to bring this down so we can get a coat on the top. And actually, as we start stripping the top, we can really see that grain start to pop a little bit. After the initial coat of remover, what you're going to notice is you'll have to apply less and less because that remover starts to soak through the finish down to the wood. So after about 15 minutes of application, you should really start to see the remover coming off fairly easy. And what you can use is with your gloved finger, just give it a little rub, and you can see the wood coming through underneath, which lets you know that the remover is doing exactly what it's supposed to do. And as I just mentioned, each time I go over, I'm more moving existing remover around than applying new remover. Because once it goes through the finish, it's just a matter of getting through to those tougher areas. And what you'll also notice is you're going to see if there's decent wood underneath, you're going to really start to see that color start to pop, which is what we're seeing over here with our chair. In its natural state, this chair should have some beautiful grain and color. Okay, our next step is going to be to take this remover off along with the existing finish. Now, what I had mentioned before, if possible, you'd like to be able to use sawdust for this process. If not, I was able to find this animal bedding at a local pet shop, which should actually work just as well, because what we're using this for is to soak up the remover as well as pull off any existing finish. So to start, I have my sawdust here in the bucket. What I'm going to do is pull myself some sawdust out of here. Now, when we remove the remover and the finish, what we want to do is work from the bottom up. We don't want to work from the top down, because what will happen is that sawdust is going to drop down onto parts that we're not ready to start, and what it's going to do is dry that remover up, thereby forcing us to apply another coat of remover. So we're going to start from the bottom up, use our brush, and start taking the remover along with the finish off. And what this does is it'll actually pull everything right out of the pores. Now you can see here as we get into areas that would normally be very difficult to work with, the use of the sawdust allows us to get into carvings, contours, any place we have to, because this brush gives us a lot of flexibility. And you can see as we're moving through, what's happening is we're not only taking off the remover, we're pulling off any existing finish. And it's also revealing some very beautiful hardwood underneath. I think this chair is going to look gorgeous with just a natural shellac finish on it. One thing to remember is a small section at a time, and just try to always work from the bottom up. Any place you see remover, you want to go with your sawdust and your brush. Now, if you find that the sawdust seems to be gumming up quite a bit, what you may want to do is either go back over with another coat of remover, or take off as much as you can with the sawdust, and then go back and spot strip any stubborn spots. Which means you're just going to go back, put another coat or two of remover on, let that soak in a little bit, and then go back with your brush and sawdust. Now, the other beauty of paste remover, especially in a situation like this with an old chair, it's not going to easily work its way into glue joints. the way a liquid remover would. So if you have some joints that the glue is really crystallized where there may be a problem compromising those joints with a liquid remover, you're not going to run into that same situation with the paste. Another important thing to remember is you should always consult your municipality, find out the proper way of disposing of any of these finishing materials, such as your remover, your sawdust that's used to take off the remover, because certain towns or municipalities may have ordinances against the disposal of these materials, or may have certain ways that you have to dispose of these materials. Now, at this point, you're probably wondering, how can I tell if there are areas that have finish if they're not always visible to the eye? And what we'll touch on next is, once we're cleaning with our solvent, which is going to be the denatured alcohol, that'll show you anything that might be invisible to the eye right now. Because what that's going to do is show you the exact color of the chair, as well as show you any spots that may have stubborn finish on them. See, I'm basically using the same sawdust over and over here, because it has the ability to absorb quite a bit in terms of finish and remover. If we have a trouble spot, it seems to be sticking a little bit more. So what I'm going to do is just go over that spot a little bit with a second coat. And we're just going to let that sit for about a minute. And what it's going to do is soften that finish right up. In the meantime, we can go back and clean up any other areas. Get some of that sawdust off. So the more we do now, the less we have to do later. We're going to go through the process the same way with the table. We're going to go with the sawdust, and we're going to start from the bottom up. Now this table looks like it should go a lot quicker than the chair. This finish seems to be very well liquefied. And usually, rule of thumb, you can figure probably about a half an hour of leaving that finish on. Leaving the remover on, rather, and you should be ready to start stripping. Now, given the fact that we have a flat surface, what I'd like to use is our flexible scraper, and we can take most of the remover off using this. And what we're going to do is work from the center out, because as I mentioned before, this is a veneered top. And if we work from the outside in, there's a good chance that we could lift up a piece of veneer and make more work for ourselves. Once we have the majority of the finish off, what I'm going to do is use a little bit of sawdust and just go very carefully so as not to lift any veneer. And again, brush from the inside out. What this is going to do is clean out the pores, take off any residual finish, as well as remove the paint remover. Our next stage in the stripping process is going to be going with denatured alcohol. For this step, we're going to use our denatured alcohol, our #1 steel wool, and a clean dry rag. The purpose of this is to take off any residual paint remover, any finish that we might have left over, and what we're going to do is we're going to clean the pores and the wood in general, which is going to make it more accepting of our finish. Now, the one thing to remember is this alcohol dries very quickly. It flashes off very fast, so you're going to have to concentrate on a small area at a time. Once we finish with the whole piece, we can go back over it with a clean rag with a little alcohol and just basically pat over the whole piece, so we're not going to see lap marks from finish or anything else. So we're going to start by getting some alcohol on our steel wool, and we're going to work our top area over here. And at the same time, what the alcohol is going to allow you to do is see the actual color of the wood. So at this point, you can determine whether or not you want to use any stain in the finishing process. Now, we're just going to make sure we keep this fairly wet with alcohol. And any spots of existing finish are going to show up as either darker or lighter spots. A situation where we have a lot of intricate carving, another great aid in this would be the use of a common toothbrush. You can wet that a little bit with alcohol and just work your way into any carvings. So what that'll do is it'll take any remover, finish, or sawdust you have in there right out, and it's going to ensure you a clean surface to finish over. Okay, then we're going to take our clean rag and we're just going to go over whatever area we've hit with alcohol and just try to get as much into those carvings and nooks and crannies as you can. The cleaner we are now, the better off we are later. Okay, now we're ready to start on our table. Now what you can see is we're moving across with the alcohol and the steel wool. That grain comes out more and more. We would say it pops a little bit more. And we can also see the actual color of the wood, which on the apron there's a possibility we may want to enhance that color a little bit, maybe add a little bit of color, and we'll see what it looks like once we're done cleaning up the rest of the table. Yeah, I think we're going to put a little stain on this base, which is great because we got one piece we're going to stain and one piece we're not. Then we'll just follow up with the toothbrush. And again, what that's going to do is just clean anything we can't get with the steel wool right out. Get our rag. Now in a situation like this, our top was badly weathered, the finish was pretty much gone. So usually, like I mentioned, I like to stay away from sanding, but I think in this case what I'd like to do is just go with a light sandpaper. What I probably recommend on something like this, if it's a fairly coarse top that you could really feel it, is no more than a 150 grit. And we can go with the alcohol, and we're going to go with the grain, and I'll demonstrate that right now. I'm going to fold that piece of sandpaper, which is going to give it a little bit more workability. And the one thing we want to remember in a situation like this is sand with the grain, with the alcohol, and just be careful for edges, because we have to remember we're working with a veneer top, which also limits us to the amount of sanding we can do. In a situation like this, we're going to see some ink stains. We're going to see some old glass marks on top, possibly some water. Some of that we're going to have to let go, and actually a lot of that adds to the beauty of the piece. I mean, it pretty much tells the story of the furniture. I'm going to go with the rag and just be careful not to pick up any possibly loose strands of veneer on the edge. Now going back over is not a necessity with the rag and the alcohol. I just tend to think it's a good practice because it tends to pick up any spots that you may have left in going with the steel wool and alcohol. And you can never clean a piece too much. Okay, next what we're going to do is take a piece of dry steel wool and we're just going to lightly go over the entire piece, looking for any white hazy type of spots from the alcohol. And basically what that is any place if we didn't wipe off the alcohol with remover and finish, it leaves a little bit of a white haze, which is easily removable with our dry steel wool. And we may have to go over those spots we filled earlier just a little bit more to make sure they're cleaned out real well. Make sure there's no residual filler over there. I think what we're going to do with this table is we're going to add just a little bit of color. Maybe make this just a little bit more attractive than it is. And the first thing we're going to do is we have a fairly messy work surface that we're using. So what we're going to want to do first is we're going to flip this board over. So we're going to do that, and we'll be back in 1 second to start our staining and finishing. In this instance, we're going to be using an oil stain. Now with oil stains, there's a multitude of different colors. But as a rule of thumb, what I've found is that they basically come in 3 different colors. Our first is going to be a brown, which is going to be your typical walnut. For most stains, it's what they'll be calling a special walnut. From there, we can get into our red tones, which is going to be more of a mahogany color. And the third being a maple, colonial maple, which is going to give us a little bit more of an orange color. So again, mixing these stains will give you sort of a custom color. And what I'd like to do with this project is start with our walnut. So we're going to use this as our base color. And these stains tend to go a long way, so we don't have to use too much. What I'd like to do is add maybe just a touch of red. And I'd like to see a little bit more orange pop through. So I'm going to add a little bit more orange. So we have our colors. We can just make sure these mix in nice. And now we're ready to stain our piece. And what you can always do if you want to be sure you're happy with the color is just try a small test area. And what I tend to like to do is pad the color on rather than brush it. And I think this is going to add just a little bit more life to our piece. Being an oil stain, this is extremely forgiving. So what we can do is we can go over our entire piece without worrying about laps or drips or anything else. And then we can go back in 5 or 10 minutes and pick most of those spots up. Now I'm not trying to muddy up the grain. All I'm trying to do is just add enough color to bring out the beauty of the wood. And with an older piece like this, you can see as we move it around in the close-ups, there's some dings and nicks and various imperfections, which to me tend to bring out the beauty and the age of the piece. I mean, they could easily be sanded out, but I'm not sure if I'd want to do that because each one of these pieces tells a story. Now we're just going to work our way through the entire piece. We're going to add our color. And there's various types of stains that can be used. The reason I chose an oil stain is because it's very forgiving to work with. If this is your first time, you'll notice that it'll have quite a bit of open time before the stain starts to dry. You can drip spots, you can have laps, and the stain will cover most of that up as it dries into the wood. And by adding colors together, you can change the color, but not to the point where one is going to stand up that much more than the others. Now with this oil stain, for the most part, you really want to let this dry overnight. because to properly dry it needs anywhere from 4 to 8 hours. And with a refinished piece, the drying time may be retarded a little bit more. So you want to give it at least 8 hours, which means the next day you can do all of your finishing. And we're just going to work our way around. And now we're ready to add a little bit of color to the top. And what this should do is also even out the color on the top just a little bit. Bring out a little bit more of the beauty. As I mentioned before, you can see some distressed areas, you can see some old stains, which with the veneer, there's really not too many ways to get those out other than touch-up. And I think in this case, I really think they kind of add to the look of the piece. Now we're just going to bring it back up and look for any areas we may have missed or lapse. And the only thing we still have to do is add a little bit of color to the draw. And a good idea when you're mixing stains like this, whatever stain you keep, pour back into one of the cans and just mark it so you know exactly what that color is, how you made it. That way if it's a color that you do like, or if it's a color you want to tweak a little bit somewhere down the road on another piece, you know exactly what your formula was. Okay, at this point now we're ready to start finishing our chair. Now while we're waiting for the stain on our table to dry, what we're going to do is we're going to start finishing our chair, which we decide to leave a natural walnut, and we can finish this using our shellac. And what I'm going to do in this situation, I'm going to use the brush to get into some of the carvings and some of the areas that I can't get in with the pad. But for the most part, any of the flat or easy to access parts, I'm going to do with the pad. And what we want to do is, well, not too heavy with the shellac, because you're going to notice this is going to start dripping pretty easy. But we want to get enough in there so we can seal this very well. So I would say with something like this walnut, the minimum you want to go with is probably 3 to 4 coats. And what we're going to do, which I'll show you as we get there, is we're going to just lightly sand and scuff in between coats. What I'm doing is I'm just working shellac into these hard to reach areas first. And then the rest, I'm going to pick up my pad and go with my pad. Which once again, being a finisher, it just comes a little bit easier. Now the one thing I'm sure you've noticed is the gloves I'm using are not the same gloves I use for stripping. These are much thinner latex gloves, which gives me a little bit more dexterity, so I can kind of really feel the surface as I'm working, which makes it a little bit easier to work. Then what I'll do is I'll just scoot around over here a little bit, so you can see from the front exactly what I'm doing and how that shellac is going on. Now it's going to go on pretty shiny, and that's okay, because later on we're going to tune that sheen down as much as we care to. Then we're going to put this on the side for about a half hour, and then we'll come back to it. Okay, we've waited about a half hour for our chair's first coat to dry. So what we're going to do is we're going to just give it a light scuffing, just to pick up any pimples, rough spots. And what that's going to do is it's going to assure us of a nice smooth finish. So first thing I'm doing is I'm going to give it a shot of our wet and dry paper that I mentioned before, which is our 600 grit black paper. And that's readily available at any home improvement center. And this is a very, very fine paper. And what it's going to do is it's just going to scuff this finish up enough to smooth it out, but not really take too much off. And whatever we don't hit with the paper, we can pick up with our Scotch-Brite, or you could use a piece of No. 1 steel wool. Either one would work sufficiently, because what we're trying to do is just smooth out most of those areas. And now with our Scotch-Brite, I'm going in, and you can see the finish, because it's dry, starts to powder a little bit. and also gets extremely smooth. That's one of the beauties of shellac, is it sands beautifully. With this walnut, I'm probably going to go at least a good 4 coats because I want to fill a lot of these pores and have a nice, almost hand-polished look to this piece of furniture. Now, shellac has been the finish of choice for finishers for about 300 years now. French have been using it in what's known as French polish. And all French polish is successive coats and then polishing of that shellac to the point where it has the look of almost glass. A good French polish is unbelievable to look at. And also quite durable. Now that we've done that, what I'm going to do is just take a dry, clean piece of cloth, wipe this down, and once we clean this off, we're ready to start with our second coat. And with this one, once again, I'm going to pad most of the finish on. If I have to, I'm going to get into a few of those hard-to-reach areas with the brush. And with this second coat, I'm going to move fairly quick. And as I said, I'm just going to try to avoid going over the same spot twice. Okay, that's coat number 2 on our chair. And we're going to put this on the side once again for about a half hour, and then come back to coat number 3. Okay, we're at day number 2. And our table appears to have dried very nicely. So what we're going to do is we're going to go with a coat of shellac as a sealer and also to give a little bit of patina and see how things look after this first coat. We're going to put a coat on and do the same thing we did with our chair. We're going to let it dry for about a half an hour, and then we're going to come back, give it a light scuff sanding, and go with a second coat. What I'd like to do is build as much finish up as I can with the shellac because it's a real time saver. And eventually what we're going to do with this, because this table may get a little bit more use than our chair will, we're going to finish the top with a couple of coats of our wipe-on poly. And what that's going to do is it's going to give us a little bit more added durability and still keep the beauty of the shellac underneath. Now while we have the table up here, we're going to also give the apron a shot. Okay, now we're ready to apply a coat of shellac to the top of our table. So what we're going to use for this is the brush. And again, nice even strokes with the grain. And what you'll see is that mahogany in the top just really start to pop right out. Now with this we're going to do the same thing we did with our chair. After we get a coat on, we'll let it sit for about a half hour. Now these times are all relative to the piece. Some pieces may take a little bit longer to dry. So a good rule of thumb, before you go with the second coat, if you want to see if it's dry enough, just try a spot that's a little bit concealed and give it a shot of your 600 paper. If it powders up and isn't very sticky to go over, you're ready to sand and go with your second coat. And with the top, I think what we're going to probably do is go at least 2 coats, maybe 3, and then we're going to urethane this. Okay, now we're ready for our second coat of finish on the table. So we're going to do just the same thing we did with the chair. We're going to lightly scuff sand our first coat of shellac. We're going to use our 600. We're going to go with the grain. And you're going to feel as you're going over, it's going to get extremely smooth. And that's just what we want. And we're going to hit the top. All of our flat surfaces we're going to do with the 600. And just again lightly scuff them, get them nice and smooth. You don't want to hit them too hard because we only have one coat of shellac on here. Any of the turned areas, we can go back with our Scotch-Brite. Work our way around the apron. Okay, now we're going to take our cloth, wipe off as much of the residue as we can. And we're ready for our second coat of shellac. And again with the second coat, try to move as quick as possible. And not go over the same area too many times. Okay, right now we're putting on our fourth and final coat of shellac. And when we finish this, we're going to put this chair down, let it sit overnight, and then we'll be ready to finish this with a little bit of 4-0 steel wool and a coat of paste wax. Now we're ready to sand our third coat of finish. We now have 3 coats of shellac on here, and what we're going to do at this point, we're going to sand everything down, top and base. The base we're going to go with a 4th coat of shellac. The top, what we're going to do is put our first of 2 coats of wipe-on poly. And the reason I'm doing this is because we'd like to give the top a little bit more durability. And the finish is actually going to look exactly the same, but the only difference will be, like I said, a little bit more durability on the top. We're going to go with our 600, as many flat surfaces as we can hit. We don't want to go too hard. And we try to take off some of the pimples and just scuff up the existing finish a little bit. And once again, I'm using our Scotch-Brite over here to get into those harder to reach areas. Now for this last coat, what we're going to do, I'm going to go with a brush, make sure we can get all this dust off. We don't want to have any residue for the last coat. We want to keep this as smooth and clean as possible. And then after that, we'll go with a clean, dry cloth. And then we're ready to go with our finish. Okay, now we're ready to use our wipe-on poly. The reason I've chosen this is because it's very user-friendly and actually can go on without showing any lap marks or streaks. So whenever you can use this in lieu of a brush-on poly, I would definitely suggest using this as an alternative. It's not going to afford you the durability because it doesn't quite have the same solids as a brush-on poly, but 2 coats of this on a top like this that's going to have limited use should be more than enough. And this is made strictly for putting on with a pad, the same way we've done our shellac. Now we've got our first coat on, and what we're going to do is we're going to let this dry for about 2 hours minimum. Then we're ready for our second coat. After our second coat goes on, we're going to let this dry overnight and then we're ready to finish along with our chair tomorrow. Our next and final step is going to be rubbing down and waxing of our furniture. What we're going to need here would be either a clean pad or a comforter, something to lay the piece of furniture on so we can move it around without damaging the finish. We're going to be using our 4-0 steel wool, 600 wet and dry paper, a medium to dark brown wax with an applicator rag, and a clean rag which we're going to use to wipe off our wax. Now we're ready to start. And what I've done is quartered our 600 wet and dry paper, and we're just going to lightly go over any of the flat surfaces, and I mean very lightly. You'll see this shellac overnight powders up very easily. And what we're doing is we're taking off imperfections, pimples, anything that's going to make it unappealing to the touch. And this is a fairly quick process. Now, after we've given it a light shot with our sandpaper, now what we're going to do is we're going to give it a good shot of 4-0 steel wool. And what we want to do is really dull down this wax surface without taking too much finish off. So we want to get in there. And being that we have a pad, we can flip our workpiece back and forth as we see fit, so we're able to see exactly where we're working and what has to be done on these surfaces. And the one thing you want to make sure is that you hit every surface, and just be careful of corners, edges, because that's where you can actually take too much finish off. So just a nice, light, even shot with the steel wool. We're going to go through the same process with our table. We're just going to give a light scuff coat with our 600 wet and dry paper. And we're just going to go by feel. So we want to pick up any imperfections or pimples in the shellac, which is usually from dust, anything that may have settled in the finish. And you'll notice as you go with this, the finish is going to get extremely smooth. Very pleasing to the touch. And just remember, contoured surfaces, edges, you want to go very lightly with both the sandpaper and the steel wool. We're just going to lightly dull down the surfaces and prepare it for waxing. Once we finish steel wooling our workpieces, what we want to do is just take a brush, clean off any of our steel wool residue as good as we can. And then we're ready to start waxing. And most of these waxes are readily available in home improvement centers. And you can see here we've chosen a medium to dark brown wax. For lighter pieces such as natural maple, natural pine, you can use a clear wax, which would be, say, a butcher's wax, something very light in color. Now to wax, what we're going to do is we're going to use our applicator. We're going to get some wax on the pad, and then we're ready to start moving. And this is a very forgiving process. You can go over the same spot 20 times if you have to, because what we want to do at this point is get a nice even coat of wax on. We want to get into a lot of these grooves, the nooks and crannies. So what this wax is going to do is it's going to even the finish out beautifully after we've steel wooled everything. So we want to make sure we get in everywhere as good as we can. And you really can't put too much on. But as long as you keep an ample amount on the pad, as I'm doing here, we should be fine. And we're just going to work our way around. And once the wax is on, we can give it a couple of minutes to dry. There's really no need for any dry time with the wax, because most of what we put on is going to come off when we take our clean cloth and wipe it. Okay, we've just about finished waxing this chair, and one thing we want to take great care to do is all these small carvings, areas, we want to make sure we really push a little bit of wax in there, because any of that powdering from our steel wool and sand, we want to make sure we remove that. Now we're ready to start buffing. We're just going to use a clean piece of sheet, and we're going to go in and we're going to work our way around the chair. And you can move quickly, and you're going to feel initially this pad's going to stick a little bit. And as you work your way around, it's just going to flow over nicer and nicer. What we're doing is we're removing just about 100% of the wax. But the portion that stays on here is what really brings the luster back to the wood. Brings our finish back. And it also removes any of the marks from steel wooling and sanding. If we want to take a little bit of the sheen off of the finished chair, all we have to do is take a dry piece of wool and very lightly go over and kind of highlight. And what this will do is it'll bring this down to a much more satiny sheen. And it gives us a choice of a high finish or more of a satin finish. Okay, now we're ready to start waxing our table. So we're simply going to give it a good waxing. And rub it into the pores real well. Take our dry cloth. I'm going to give it a good rub down. And the one thing we have to remember when we steel wool this top is always go with the grain. And when we wax this finish, what will happen is it's going to take all those steel wool marks away, and we have our finished product. With these techniques we've showed you, it makes it feasible for the weekend finisher to finish these projects, usually within a couple of days' time. And they're ready for use right away.